Okay, so let's talk about some examples of international terrorist organizations. And the reason that we're focusing on the Taliban and Al Qaeda is those are definitely two of the groups that get a lot of the public media attention, have been obviously hot topics in some of the wars that the U.S. has waged over the past several years. And I just want to make sure that you guys have a very basic understanding of some of the differences and some of the similarities that you can think of between these two groups of international terrorist organizations. So when we're talking about the Taliban is an example of an organization with Islamic roots, although kind of a radical version of that. And you know, the Taliban group is actually an organization that ruled Afghanistan from 1996 to 2001. They captured Kabul essentially and had the political control of Afghanistan for the end of the 20th century. Current leader of Taliban, at least the face of the organization, would be Mullah Muhammad Omar. And the reason I have a question mark there is it's very unclear what the structure of the decision making is within the Taliban. Omar seems to be their face, but how many of the decisions on a daily basis are actually attributed to him or people acting on his behalf is still very unclear. So the Taliban, just to give you some idea, very basic idea of the group that we're talking about here, is a group of people that found refuge from Afghanistan in Pakistan back in the 90s. So they're Pakistan based, but they have Afghanistan roots. And they're dominated by people that identify themselves as Pashtun, which is kind of Afghanistan tribesmen with Pashtun identity were kind of the original founders of this organization. So one big thing that differentiates the Taliban from an organization like Al Qaeda is they're primarily a military kind of political organization. In other words, they believe, what we believe is their most important mission and most important goal is they really want to regain control and power over Afghanistan. They essentially believe that Afghanistan as a country is something that they have a right to be in control of. They were kind of overthrown in 2001, and they've since 2001 engaged in acts of extreme violence and terrorism, basically trying to regain power in Afghanistan. So it's kind of an interesting group because at least outside of the Middle Eastern region, they're not always necessarily attributed as being responsible for terrorist incidents throughout the world. But within the region, they have exerted an extreme amount of violence and terror over people in the area. Some interesting kind of different things to differentiate them again from Al Qaeda. They don't necessarily have any. They really diverge from Al Qaeda in the fact that they seem to at least convey acceptance for all Islamic rules and branches in Afghanistan. They don't necessarily, in other words, seem to be concerned with people completely identifying with a specific form of Islam. What's more important for the Taliban is regaining control of the country of Afghanistan in the future. Obviously, the most that the Taliban has come to an American discourse, and their most famous act, as far as Americans are concerned, is the fact that they offered safe haven to Osama bin Laden after the September 11th attacks in 2001. So let's talk about Al Qaeda for a few minutes and talk about some of the differences, but also some of the similarities between them and the Taliban. So again, terrorist organization with some kind of Islamic roots, but not a group of people that the vast majority of people who would identify themselves as Muslim would consider representing them. So Al Qaeda, current leader, obviously not Osama bin Laden anymore, but the current kind of interim leader is a man named Saif Adel. And again, we call him interim because it's very hard to understand kind of right now, since Osama bin Laden was killed, what exactly is going on in the organizational structure of Al Qaeda. It's a very fragmented group at the moment. And essentially, the group was formed as a group of Sunni Muslims practicing a very specific form of Wahhabism, the most extreme and violent form of Islam. So this is a group that has a little bit of a different kind of mission and purpose that they seem to be putting forth. Their agenda seems to be much more the desire to wage kind of a global holy war. So, essentially what they talk about in some of the propaganda that they put out is urging everyone who's Muslim to fight attacks on Muslims across the world. They call it a defensive jihad. The idea being that if there are regimes, governments throughout the world who seem like they oppose or oppress Muslim citizens, you know, Muslims who practice this very specific form of Wahhabism are encouraged to retaliate, to act in act violently on behalf of this organization. So the reason that these two groups are kind of connected is obviously the fact that they're in the same regions, they're living in very similar regions of the world, and they've had communication in terms of exchanging money and weapons and training for safe haven. So the Taliban is famous for giving safe haven to Al Qaeda members in exchange for Al Qaeda members providing the Taliban with arms, money, training them to hopefully, in their eyes, one day take over Afghanistan again. Again, this is a very introductory level look into these organizations. I don't expect you guys to become an expert on this, on, the details, the very minute details of these organizations. We don't have the time, and I don't have the expertise to really go through that in its entirety. But I wanted to give you some real facts about the two groups so that when you hear about these things more in the future, you can have something to say, you can differentiate and know if someone's talking about Al Qaeda, what exactly it is that they're talking about. In terms of understanding the presence of different terrorist groups in the United States, that is something that is obviously of great concern to the American public, understanding, what types of groups are present in different parts of the country. And so what's interesting to look at is what police agencies report on acts of terrorism and far extremist groups and the presence of those things in different parts of the country. So the START Center is something that I want to introduce you guys to. For those of you who are interested in maybe one day working with or studying terrorist groups, the START Center is the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism center at the University of Maryland. And essentially it's really one of the preeminent places where research and data collection and reports get issued, extensively studying these terrorist organizations. And really interesting study that they published a few years ago now. Essentially what they did in the study is they solicited the responses of law enforcement agencies, police agencies throughout the country. And they asked these law enforcement agencies, they tried to get a very representative sample of them throughout the country. And they basically asked them, what kind of groups are present in your state? And what they did is they came up with a chart of the top, 20 or so groups that have a presence in a large number of United States, in a large presence in the United States. So I just wanted you to take a look at some of the percentages here, because what those percentages show you is that, for example, the very top one there, neo-Nazi organizations, that 92% number, what that's telling you is in 92% of all the states, law enforcement within them report that there is a presence of that group. So in 92% of the states, there's some kind of neo-Nazi organization presence. And I really just wanted you to take a look at the top 4 there. Because after that, the numbers kind of, go down a decent amount. But look at the top 4 groups that states report having a presence of in their region. So we've got neo-Nazi groups, we've got militia patriot groups, we've got racist skinhead organizations. Not exactly sure, what gets you into some of these different categories. And then you've got kind of freeman, sovereign citizen groups. Those are groups that are even to the further extreme of kind of Tea Party movements in terms of how much, government oversight and control we should have in this country. So those top 4 aren't probably, if I had asked you guys beforehand, what do you guys think police report would be the top 4 groups, that might have not entered into your maybe perception. And I think that's one thing that surprises people in terms of the amount of Islamic jihadi groups, which some people think of as probably being the biggest threat in the United States, at least in terms of their presence in the United States and our awareness and perception of them. it's not quite as high as some of these other extremist groups that engage in acts of domestic terrorism somewhat frequently. Another kind of group that keeps increasing in the START Center's awareness is extreme anti-immigration groups and some of the violent acts that have been engaged in on behalf of those groups. So there's a couple other kind of weird categories in here that some of you probably have never heard of. Odinists are, well, it's basically a form of neo-Viking paganism. That's the best I can really tell you. And there's a couple other kind of groups, idiosyncratic sectarians. That's basically a white supremacist group. I'm not sure how the START Center differentiated between that and KKK, racist skinheads. I'm not exactly sure. But, I just wanted you to get an idea for some of the groups that have the largest presence and some of the groups that might surprise you to not necessarily have as large of a presence. Another kind of interesting thing that came out of this report in 2008 from the START Center was what they asked state police agencies to report, in a bunch of these, the top couple extremist groups that they noted were a presence in their state. They basically asked state police agencies to report how much of a threat do you think that this group poses on a national level and just within your state. So here's where you kind of see a real difference from the amount that they actually believe is a presence in their state and in their area, and the amount of threat that presence actually might have. So in terms of if you think back to the previous slide, police agencies only reported in about 62% of the states that there were identified known Islamic jihadist groups within their area. But these were the groups that exerted, at least by law enforcement agencies' mindset, the most perceived threat, both internationally and just in terms of their own state. So over 2/3 of state police agencies think that Islamic jihadists, extreme environmentalists, extreme animal rights activists, racist skinheads, neo-Nazis, and patriot groups pose a threat to our national security. Over 2/3 of police agencies report that those couple at the top there are the ones that they are the most worried about. And after that, the perceived threat goes down. So it's kind of interesting to compare with the slide that you just saw. Even though there's a larger presence of some groups that maybe aren't on this chart anymore, these are the groups that the law enforcement is actually the most worried about, at least in terms of domestic terrorism. Now, for those of you who are interested in this area, this is definitely not an area that I would consider myself an expert in, but I have the benefit of being able to read and, look at research briefs and reports that are coming out from probably one of the most influential research institutes that studies terrorism, and that's the START Center at the University of Maryland. So for those of you who are interested in studying, researching, working in terrorism, homeland security, anything like that, I really encourage you to take a look at the START Center's website. They have excellent internships. They have excellent research opportunities there. Just take a look at the website, take a look at some reports. For those of you who think you might be interested in this, they have some really great kind of quick little briefs that can give you a lot of information in a really short amount of time and educate you on some of these groups that people tend to just throw the names around of, and maybe nobody actually has a really academic, thorough understanding of what they're talking about. So my advice to you guys is don't just take this lecture as your information about terrorism, but go out and do some reading, do some research, read from people who make this their life's work and are really experts at it, if it's something that interests you in the future. Okay, so that's it for this week. Don't forget about your discussion this week, which has to do with the National Data Exchange. And I will see you in class on Thursday.